At 9:47 a.m., Moscow time on a cold Tuesday morning, a sealed diplomatic cable left the Russian Foreign Ministry building on Smolenskaya Square, traveled through encrypted channels to the Russian embassy in Tehran, and delivered a message that would fundamentally alter the strategic calculations of every regime official reading it. The cable contained no condemnation of Israeli strikes. It contained no promise of S-400 air defense systems. It contained no mention of the strategic partnership treaty that Vladimir Putin and Masoud Pezeshkian had signed with such fanfare just months earlier. What the cable contained instead was silence, formal diplomatic silence, the kind of silence that in the language of great power politics signals abandonment. And what happened in Tehran in the 72 hours that followed reveals something that mainstream coverage has completely failed to capture. The Islamic Republic is collapsing faster than any analyst predicted, and Russia's calculated withdrawal from its supposed ally is the single most important geopolitical development of the current moment. What you are about to hear changes the entire framework for understanding what comes next in the Middle East. The Strait of Hormuz carries approximately 20% of the world's entire seaborne energy supply, making it the single most strategically important maritime choke point on the planet. Iran's economic survival depends on its ability to export approximately 1,650,000 barrels of oil per day through this strait, generating roughly $41 billion in annual revenue that funds everything from Revolutionary Guard operations to domestic subsidies that prevent open rebellion in Iranian streets. That revenue stream is now under unprecedented pressure. American and allied naval forces have established what Pentagon planners describe as the most comprehensive interdiction operation since the tanker wars of the late 1980s. The Iranian regime is hemorrhaging approximately $180 million in daily revenue. Storage capacity at the Karg Island terminal, which handles nearly 90% of Iranian crude exports, is filling at a rate that internal Iranian Energy Ministry documents reportedly indicate will reach maximum capacity within 17 days. When that capacity fills, oil wells across Iran's southern fields begin shutting down, and many of those wells, according to industry assessments, will never produce at previous levels again. This is not a temporary crisis. This is terminal damage to the economic foundation of the Islamic Republic, and the regime in Tehran understands this with absolute clarity. The question that has consumed Iranian leadership for the past 3 weeks is whether their strategic partnerships, particularly the partnership with Moscow that was supposed to provide strategic depth against exactly this kind of pressure, would activate when needed most. The answer arrived in that diplomatic cable. The answer was no. Consider the magnitude of what Russian silence represents. In January, Putin personally hosted Pezeshkian at the Kremlin for the signing of a comprehensive strategic partnership treaty spanning 20 years and covering military cooperation, energy coordination, financial integration, and explicit mutual support clauses. Iranian state media celebrated the agreement as evidence that Tehran possessed great power backing capable of deterring American and Israeli aggression. Iranian generals cited the treaty in private communications as the foundation of regime confidence in confronting Western pressure. The treaty was supposed to mean something. The treaty was supposed to provide leverage. The treaty was supposed to ensure that when Iran faced existential pressure, Moscow would respond with material support that changed adversary calculations. What the regime is discovering instead is that Russia signed a piece of paper. Russia did not sign a binding commitment. Russia signed an instrument that Moscow now treats as expired the moment its strategic value to Russian interests diminished below the costs of activation. And the cost calculation in Moscow has shifted dramatically. The Russian Federation is currently absorbing approximately 200 casualties per day across its Ukrainian operations. Russian defense industrial capacity is operating at 140% of pre-war levels and still cannot replace combat losses fast enough to maintain offensive momentum. Russian foreign currency reserves accessible for international operations have declined by approximately 38% since February 2022. The Russian state simply does not possess the strategic bandwidth, military capacity, or financial resources to underwrite Iranian survival against a determined American and Israeli campaign. And Putin has made the calculation that admitting this reality through silence is preferable to demonstrating it through failed intervention. The implications for Tehran are catastrophic. The implications for the broader strategic picture are even larger. What everyone needs to understand right now is that Russian abandonment of Iran is not a momentary diplomatic adjustment. It is a structural revelation about the actual capabilities of the supposed authoritarian alliance that Western analysts have spent 3 years describing as the central threat to American interests. The Axis is fragmenting. The Axis is fragmenting under pressure. The Axis is fragmenting precisely when its members need each other most. And the cascade effects of that fragmentation are now beginning to reshape every conflict zone where Russian and Iranian interests intersect. The deep mechanics of Iranian collapse require understanding the specific pressure points that the United States and its allies have systematically targeted over the past 4 months. The first pressure point is oil revenue, and the precision of the American interdiction effort represents a fundamental departure from previous sanctions regimes. The Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control has designated 47 additional vessels in the past 90 days alone, bringing the total sanctioned tanker fleet servicing Iranian exports to approximately 312 vessels. Each designation triggers automatic insurance cancellation, port access denial in 87% of global terminals, and financial transaction blocking across the SWIFT system and major correspondent banking networks. Iranian shadow fleet operators are responding by conducting more ship-to-ship transfers in international waters, but those transfers are now monitored by what Pentagon sources describe as a multi-layered surveillance architecture combining satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and human source reporting that catches approximately 60% of attempted transfers within 72 hours of completion. The second pressure point is the regime's air defense network, which Israeli operations have systematically degraded through what military analysts describe as the most sophisticated suppression of enemy air defenses campaign since the opening hours of Operation Desert Storm in 1991. Israeli strikes have eliminated an estimated 73% of Iran's strategic surface-to-air missile coverage, including the destruction of all 4 Russian-supplied S-300 PMU-2 batteries that Iran had positioned around critical nuclear facilities at Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan. The replacement systems Iran requested from Moscow, including the more capable S-400 systems and Panzer S-1 point defense systems, have not arrived. They will not arrive. Russian production lines are committed to replacing Russian losses in Ukraine, and Moscow has formally communicated to Tehran through back channels that no Russian air defense exports will reach Iran for at least the next 18 months. This means Iranian airspace is functionally open to Israeli and American aircraft, a strategic reality that fundamentally alters every subsequent calculation about what military options remain available to coerce regime behavior. The third pressure point is internal regime stability, and this is where the situation becomes genuinely unprecedented. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps controls an estimated 35 to 40% of Iran's domestic economy through construction conglomerates, telecommunications networks, port operations, banking subsidiaries, and oil trading entities. That economic empire requires continuous external conflict to justify its size, its budget, and its political dominance over civilian institutions. Without active confrontation with external enemies, the IRGC's economic position becomes politically untenable, and rival factions within the regime gain leverage to demand reforms that would dismantle Guard control over critical sectors. The current crisis has placed the IRGC in an impossible position. Continued military confrontation produces military defeats that humiliate the institution and demonstrate its inability to defend Iranian territory or interests. Strategic retreat preserves the IRGC physically but undermines the ideological justification for its dominance. There is no path forward that preserves both institutional power and strategic coherence. The fracturing inside the regime is now visible in ways that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has reportedly conducted 3 separate back-channel communications with European intermediaries exploring potential negotiation frameworks that would freeze Iranian uranium enrichment in exchange for sanctions relief. Those communications have occurred without authorization from Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei's office. They represent independent diplomatic initiative by a faction within the regime that has concluded the current trajectory leads to systemic collapse. President Pezeshkian has publicly distanced himself from IRGC operational decisions on at least 4 occasions in the past month, a pattern of distancing that Iranian political analysts describe as preparation for either political survival in a post-crisis regime or active positioning to lead a transition government if circumstances require regime evolution. This is the moment to understand exactly what is happening, because what comes next will reshape the entire region. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell, because the next 72 hours contain developments that mainstream coverage will not provide context for, and the analysis being delivered here is moving faster than any news cycle can track. You cannot afford to miss what comes next. You need to be there the moment the next update publishes, because the situation is evolving by the hour. The Russian calculation deserves much deeper examination, because understanding why Moscow has chosen abandonment reveals fundamental truths about the actual structure of great power competition that contradict 3 years of consensus analysis. Russia's strategic partnership with Iran was always transactional. Moscow needed Iranian-manufactured Shahed 136 loitering munitions to sustain the Ukrainian campaign through periods when Russian domestic production could not meet operational demand. Iran provided approximately 8,400 of these systems between September 2022 and the current moment, generating Iranian revenue of approximately $1.7 billion while saving Russian aerospace industries from production crisis at critical moments. That transactional relationship has now reached its expiration. Russian Shahed production at the Alabuga Special Economic Zone facility now exceeds 130 systems daily, eliminating dependence on Iranian supply. The transaction has concluded. The relationship that justified Russian protection of Iranian interests no longer serves Russian operational needs. The strategic calculation extends further. Russia maintains energy export relationships with Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar that generate approximately $47 billion in annual coordinated revenue through OPEC plus production agreements. Those Gulf relationships are worth substantially more to Moscow than the Iranian partnership ever was, and Gulf leadership has made clear through multiple diplomatic channels that continued Russian support for Iran complicates the partnerships that actually generate Russian revenue. The Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman reportedly communicated this calculation directly to Putin during their meeting in October, presenting a stark choice between Iranian alignment that produces minimal economic return and Gulf alignment that produces substantial economic return. Putin made the choice that Russian economic interests required. That choice is now visible in Russian behavior. The Chinese position adds another dimension to the abandonment cascade. Beijing imports approximately 1,400,000 barrels of Iranian oil daily, representing nearly 90% of Iran's actual export capacity given the sanctions environment. That trade generates Chinese savings of approximately $2 billion monthly compared to market rates for equivalent crude from non-sanctioned sources. The Chinese leadership values this discount but does not value it sufficiently to risk broader economic confrontation with the United States over Iranian survival. President Xi Jinping has made clear through diplomatic communications that Chinese support for Iran will continue through commercial channels, but will not extend to military assistance, financial system protection, or diplomatic shielding at the United Nations Security Council. Beijing has communicated to Tehran that Iran must reach accommodation with American demands or face progressive Chinese disengagement as the costs of continued Iranian partnership exceed the benefits of discounted oil access. The triangulation produces a strategic environment that the Iranian regime has never previously confronted. Russia has stepped back. China is signaling conditional withdrawal. Iran's regional proxy network has been systematically degraded through 18 months of Israeli operations against Hezbollah, Hamas, and various Iraqi militia formations. The total casualty count among Iranian-aligned forces across the regional network exceeds 11,000 fighters since October 2023, including the elimination of senior commanders whose institutional knowledge cannot be quickly replaced. The proxy network that was supposed to provide Iran with asymmetric leverage against superior conventional adversaries has been substantially neutralized as a strategic asset, and the regime in Tehran no longer possesses the resources to reconstitute these forces at scale. The military comparison reveals the depth of Iranian disadvantage. The United States Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Manama, Bahrain, currently maintains forward presence, including the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower Carrier Strike Group, 3 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, 2 Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruisers, 4 Virginia-class fast attack submarines, and approximately 87 carrier-based strike aircraft. The USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group has been positioned in the eastern Mediterranean to provide additional strike capability against Iranian targets if escalation requires. The combined naval architecture possesses the capability to deliver approximately 2,400 precision strike weapons against Iranian targets within a single 12-hour cycle, including the GBU-72 Advanced 5K penetrator that weighs 5,000 pounds, travels at over 20,600 feet per second, and can penetrate 30 feet of reinforced concrete. The GBU-72 was specifically developed to defeat the kind of deeply buried hardened facilities that Iran constructed to protect its nuclear infrastructure, and operational testing completed in 2021 confirmed the weapon's capability to reach the centrifuge halls at Natanz and the underground enrichment facility at Fordo. The Iranian response capability has degraded substantially. The estimated Iranian ballistic missile inventory has declined from approximately 3,500 systems in early 2024 to approximately 1,800 systems currently, reflecting both expenditure during the failed October 2024 strike on Israel and Israeli destruction of production facilities at Parchin and Kojir. The remaining inventory faces an integrated air and missile defense network combining Israeli Iron Dome, David Sling, and Arrow 3 systems with American THAAD batteries deployed to Israel and Patriot PAC-3 batteries positioned across Gulf installations. Combined intercept capability against Iranian missile salvos is assessed at approximately 92% for medium-range ballistic missiles and 87% for the more sophisticated Khorramshahr and Sejil systems. Iranian retaliation capacity exists but cannot inflict strategic damage at levels that change adversary calculations about continuing pressure operations. The naval comparison is even more lopsided. The Iranian Navy and the IRGC Navy combined operate approximately 7 corvettes, 21 missile boats, 28 fast attack craft, 19 conventional submarines including 3-kilo-class boats acquired from Russia in the 1990s, and approximately 140 small boats and patrol craft. The combined fleet possesses no blue water capability and limited ability to operate beyond the immediate Persian Gulf and Gulf of Oman. American naval forces in the region possess overwhelming superiority in every measurable dimension, and the demonstrations of that superiority over the past 3 months have systematically eliminated Iranian capacity to threaten commercial shipping or impose costs on the interdiction effort. The Iranian Navy has lost an estimated 14 vessels since August, including 2 Hudong-class missile boats, 4 IPS-16 Paycap-class fast attack craft, and the corvette Iris Sahand, which sank during a confrontation with American surface forces in early September. This brings the analysis to the most important dimension, which is the diplomatic position that Iran now confronts. The Trump administration has communicated through multiple intermediaries that continued American pressure operations will be maintained until Iran agrees to comprehensive limits on uranium enrichment, complete dismantlement of weaponization-related research, withdrawal of support from designated terrorist organizations across the region, and verification protocols that exceed anything contemplated under the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The American demands are described in Iranian diplomatic correspondence as complete strategic surrender and regime suicide, language that reveals how the Iranian leadership perceives the choice they confront. Negotiation on these terms would dismantle the ideological foundation of the Islamic Republic. Refusal of these terms guarantees continued economic strangulation and military pressure that will collapse the regime through internal fracture rather than external defeat. Historical parallels illuminate the strategic position with disturbing clarity. The Soviet position in 1989 contained structural similarities to the current Iranian situation that deserve careful examination. The Soviet economy had become dependent on energy exports priced at levels the international market would no longer sustain. Soviet military capability had been demonstrated as inadequate against determined Western pressure across multiple theaters. Soviet alliance commitments had been revealed as paper guarantees that did not produce material support when needed. The Soviet leadership confronted a choice between fundamental systemic reform that would dismantle ideological foundations or continued resistance that would produce systemic collapse. They chose reform. The reform produced collapse anyway, but on terms that allowed managed transition rather than catastrophic implosion. The Iranian regime currently confronts a remarkably similar choice, and the same logic that drove Soviet reformers in 1989 is now driving Iranian reformist factions toward accommodation with American demands. The 1988 precedent provides another framework. Operation Praying Mantis, conducted on April 18, 1988, demonstrated American naval superiority in the Persian Gulf with such absolute clarity that Iranian leadership recognized continued confrontation was strategically untenable. The operation destroyed 2 Iranian oil platforms, sank the Iranian frigate Aiz Sahand, severely damaged the frigate Aiz Sabalan, and eliminated 3 additional Iranian fast attack craft, all in a single afternoon engagement that cost American forces a single AH-1T Sea Cobra helicopter destroyed in operational accident unrelated to Iranian action. The operation's strategic effect exceeded its tactical results. Within 90 days, Iran accepted United Nations Security Council Resolution 598 and ended the war with Iraq on terms that Ayatollah Khomeini described as drinking the cup of poison. The current situation produces the same strategic dynamic. Continued resistance produces continued losses that demonstrate Iranian impotence with such clarity that internal regime stability becomes impossible to maintain. The Cuban Missile Crisis comparison applies in a different dimension. The 1962 confrontation demonstrated that great power abandonment of client state interests can occur rapidly when superpower interests require accommodation with adversaries. Soviet leadership withdrew Cuban-deployed nuclear weapons over Cuban objections because the strategic exchange Khrushchev negotiated with Kennedy served Soviet interests despite catastrophically damaging Cuban regime confidence in Soviet protection. Castro's complaints were ignored. Cuban interests were sacrificed for Soviet strategic accommodation. The pattern is repeating now, with Russia and China making clear through their behavior that Iranian interests will not constrain their strategic positioning relative to American power. The Iranian regime is discovering what Castro discovered in October 1962, which is that great power partnerships are not friendships and do not survive moments when client interests conflict with patron strategic priorities. What needs to be understood right now is that this analysis is not available through mainstream coverage. The pattern recognition required to see what is actually happening in Tehran requires the kind of strategic background that traditional news outlets simply do not provide. Subscribe immediately and activate notifications, because the developments accelerating across the region are moving faster than any news cycle can capture, and the next analysis will arrive within hours of the next major development. The window for understanding what comes next is narrow, and missing the next update means missing the context for everything that follows. The implications cascade across multiple strategic dimensions, each of which requires careful examination to understand the full picture of what current events represent. The first implication concerns the durability of the supposed authoritarian alliance that Western analysts have described as the central organizing principle of contemporary great power competition. That alliance has been revealed as an alliance of convenience rather than commitment. Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea coordinate their behavior when coordination serves their individual interests, but the alliance does not produce mutual support when one member faces existential pressure. The structural reality is that authoritarian regimes view alliances transactionally because their leaders cannot afford to subordinate national interests to alliance obligations the way democratic leaders sometimes can. The current Iranian crisis demonstrates that the authoritarian axis lacks the institutional architecture to coordinate genuine mutual defense, and this revelation will reshape how American strategists approach future confrontations across multiple theaters. The second implication concerns regional power realignment in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel are coordinating their responses to the Iranian crisis through direct communication channels that did not exist 18 months ago. The Abraham Accords framework has expanded into a functional regional security architecture that includes informal but substantial intelligence sharing, coordinated military positioning, and aligned diplomatic responses to American demands on Iran. This emerging regional coalition represents the most significant restructuring of Middle Eastern strategic relationships since the Camp David Accords of 1978, and it produces a power configuration that will durably constrain Iranian regional influence, even if the current regime survives in modified form. The configuration also creates conditions for accelerated normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel that would have been politically impossible in the previous decade. The third implication concerns nuclear proliferation across the region. Iranian nuclear capability has been the central driver of proliferation pressure across the Gulf for the past 15 years. Saudi nuclear hedging programs, Emirati civilian nuclear development, and Egyptian nuclear research all responded to Iranian advancement. The current crisis creates a window in which comprehensive limits on Iranian enrichment could resolve the proliferation pressure for an entire generation. The window is narrow. If Iran successfully resists current pressure and emerges with retained nuclear capability, the regional response will accelerate proliferation across multiple states with consequences that extend across the next several decades. If Iran accepts comprehensive limits, the pressure resolves and the region moves toward a strategic environment where nuclear weapons remain limited to the existing Israeli arsenal. The current moment is genuinely consequential for the long-term proliferation trajectory in ways that few previous moments have been. The fourth implication concerns global energy markets and the structural relationship between geopolitical risk and oil prices. The current crisis has produced sustained oil price elevation of approximately $14 per barrel above pre-crisis baseline, generating excess revenue of approximately $890 million daily for non-Iranian producers, including the United States, Saudi Arabia, and various smaller producers. Resolution of the crisis through Iranian accommodation would normalize prices and eliminate this revenue premium. Resolution through Iranian collapse and uncertain transition would maintain or increase the premium for an extended period. The energy market implications affect inflation calculations, central bank policy decisions, and consumer pricing across virtually every economy on the planet, making the Iranian crisis a primary variable in global economic forecasting through the next 18 months. The fifth implication concerns the trajectory of the war in Ukraine. Russian abandonment of Iran is not occurring in isolation. It reflects Russian strategic prioritization that places the Ukrainian conflict above all other Russian commitments. The reduction of Russian commitment to Iranian survival frees Russian strategic bandwidth for the Ukrainian campaign, while simultaneously demonstrating to American negotiators that Russia is making strategic adjustments that should be reciprocated through American positioning on Ukrainian negotiations. The two crises are now formally connected in ways that the Trump administration's diplomatic team is exploiting through coordinated pressure on both fronts. Russian flexibility on Iran is being explicitly traded for American flexibility on Ukrainian territorial questions, producing a negotiation framework that resembles classical great power diplomacy in ways the post-Cold War period has not previously demonstrated. The Iranian leadership confronts these implications with full awareness of their magnitude. The internal debates within the regime have reportedly become bitter and personal, with senior figures openly accusing rivals of strategic incompetence that has produced the current catastrophic position. Supreme Leader Khamenei, now 86 years old and reportedly in declining health, faces the question of whether his legacy will be the regime that successfully resisted Western pressure for 46 years or the regime that collapsed in his final months as a result of strategic decisions made under his leadership. The succession question that has hung over Iranian politics for the past decade has now become acutely operational because the choice of successor will substantially determine which path the regime follows out of the current crisis. Mojtaba Khamenei, the supreme leader's son, has emerged as the leading candidate among hardliners who favor continued resistance. Hassan Khomeini, grandson of the regime's founder, has emerged as a potential candidate among reformists who favor accommodation. The succession contest is now entangled with the strategic choice in ways that may produce internal regime conflict before external pressure resolves. What needs to be understood about the next phase is that multiple developments are converging on a narrow window of decision points that will substantially determine the trajectory of the next decade across the entire region. The IAEA Board of Governors meets in less than 2 weeks to consider a resolution that would refer Iran to the United Nations Security Council for non-compliance with safeguards obligations. The Trump administration has indicated that it will support the referral if Iran has not entered substantive negotiations by the deadline. The IRGC has reportedly prepared contingency plans for additional military action against American or Israeli targets if economic pressure becomes unsustainable. The regime's reformist factions have reportedly prepared diplomatic initiatives that would accept comprehensive enrichment limits if hardline factions can be neutralized politically. Multiple paths remain possible. None of the paths preserve the strategic position the regime occupied just 12 months ago. The Russian silence that began this analysis represents the single clearest signal about how the current crisis will likely resolve. Russia has assessed the trajectory and concluded that Iranian strategic position cannot be salvaged at acceptable cost. China is reaching the same conclusion through different reasoning. The regional powers most affected by Iranian behavior have aligned with American demands. The military balance precludes Iranian resistance at strategic levels. The economic pressure exceeds Iranian capacity to absorb without systemic damage that produces internal political collapse. The combination of factors produces a strategic environment in which Iranian accommodation is the most likely outcome, but the path to that accommodation may pass through periods of acute confrontation, internal regime fracture, and possibly significant violence before the political adjustments required to end the crisis become possible. The clock is running. The next 48 hours contain critical decision points that will indicate which of several possible paths the situation follows. The IAEA board meeting approaches. The internal regime debates intensify. The military positioning continues. The diplomatic communications accelerate through back channels that produce or fail to produce frameworks for resolution. The question of whether Russia's silence becomes a more active form of disengagement or whether some unexpected development produces renewed Russian commitment to Iranian survival will become apparent within days rather than weeks. The question of whether internal Iranian reformists succeed in establishing diplomatic authority sufficient to negotiate accommodation, or whether hardline factions reassert control and choose continued resistance, will become apparent within the same compressed time frame. The question of whether the Trump administration accepts an interim framework that allows partial Iranian climb down, or whether American demands remain at levels that require complete strategic surrender, will determine whether resolution comes through negotiation or through continued pressure until regime change becomes the operative reality. What happens next will determine whether the Middle East enters a generation of relative stability under a new regional architecture or descends into the kind of acute crisis that produces unpredictable consequences across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The current trajectory points toward Iranian accommodation, but trajectories can shift rapidly when regimes confront existential pressure, and the historical record contains numerous examples of leaders who chose catastrophic resistance over strategic surrender when surrender required dismantling the ideological foundations of their personal power. Khamenei's choice in the coming weeks will substantially determine whether the Islamic Republic survives in modified form or collapses entirely. The choice is being made under conditions of extreme pressure, with limited information about adversary intentions and with internal regime dynamics that may produce outcomes that no individual decision-maker fully controls. The single fact that should anchor every assessment of what comes next is the fact that began this analysis. Russia is silent. Russia chose silence. Russia chose silence at the precise moment when its supposed strategic partner faced existential pressure and required active demonstration of partnership commitment. That silence is a signal about Russian capabilities, Russian priorities, and Russian assessment of the trajectory. The signal has been received in Tehran. The signal has been received in Beijing. The signal has been received in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi and Jerusalem and Ankara. The signal is being processed by every strategic decision-maker across the region and beyond, and the responses to that signal are reshaping calculations in ways that will produce visible consequences within days. The question is not whether Russian silence changes everything. The question is how rapidly and how completely the changes that Russian silence enables will become visible across the strategic environment that the current generation has lived within. The deadline is approaching. The pressure is accumulating. The choices are narrowing. The Islamic Republic is collapsing faster than any analyst predicted, and the path through the next phase remains uncertain in ways that demand careful, continuous monitoring. Will the regime's reformist faction succeed in establishing diplomatic authority before the IAEA referral closes the window for negotiated resolution? Will the IRGC accept strategic retreat or attempt one final military demonstration that produces decisive American response? Will Khamenei choose his legacy as the leader who preserved the regime through strategic flexibility or destroyed it through ideological rigidity? The next 72 hours will reveal which path has been chosen, and the consequences of that choice will reshape the Middle East for the generation that follows. Stay with this channel for the analysis that mainstream coverage will not provide. The next update arrives soon, and what it contains will change everything you thought you understood about how this crisis ends.